Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three topics. The first one's going to be the ongoing illegal blockade of Artsakh by the Aliyev regime and the sort of the corresponding negotiations that are going on in DC between the two sides. Then we're going to move on to some interesting developments in regards to the Turkish elections that are coming up in a couple of weeks. And we're going to end the show with some observations about the 108th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. We're going to start with the first topic of the week, which is the ongoing illegal blockade of Artsakh. And at this point, it's past the 140-day mark. The blockade is actually tightening. It's reported that it takes 2 or 3 days of negotiations by the International Red Cross and the Russian peacekeepers for the regime thugs to allow any packages or people to go in and out of Artsakh. Obviously, all of this is in violation of international law. This week, there was a package, there was a few trucks that had limited amount of food that they were crossing, and they were deliberately kept for 14 hours, hoping to rot or damage as much of the food as possible. During this time, the regime has actually established an X-ray machine to search for luggage, as you have in the airport. And they also did this dog and pony show in which they lied to a group of Armenians that had negotiated, they already had a negotiated passage through by the Russian peacekeepers to put them through this, what looked like a customs package in which they're handing over passports for approval by the thugs from the regime. And this was all set up. There's no such understanding. They were essentially lied to so they can put up a photo of this or video of it. The regime is trying to make this very normalized, that we have a border post, people can come and go, which is a complete lie on the face of it. Now let's move on to the corresponding negotiations about the peace negotiations between Armenia, the Aliyev regime, and the United States in Washington, D.C., and that's going on currently. The talks that preceded by a call from U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken to Ilham in Baku, in which he stressed again the importance of opening up the corridor, and obviously Ilham was not responsive. What do we know about the talks? Frankly, we don't know too many specifics. We know that there is a document on the table that's being negotiated that was confirmed by the Prime Minister yesterday. The second thing that we do know is that these talks are all-encompassing and they essentially cover all corresponding issues. As a side note to this, the State Department declared that they're calling on both sides to come up with plans or proposals that would protect the rights and securities of the Armenians of Artsakh, which frankly is a joke, because when one party right now is trying to starve those same people out, what makes you believe that that one party, in this case the Aliyev regime, is ever going to come up with any scenario that would protect the rights or securities of the Armenians of Artsakh? What is the most likely outcome here? The most likely outcome to these negotiations that Ilham walks away and nothing is signed. Why is that? And I think there's three specific reasons for that. He will never sign anything that will preclude ethnic cleansing, because that is his ultimate goal. Secondly, because of Russian pressure, because the Russians want to kill these negotiations, make sure that nothing is signed, because the current uncertain situation serves both Russian interests and the interests of the regime in Baku. And lastly, and most importantly, any kind of a final settlement and peace agreement with the regime in Baku will essentially start the clock towards the end of that regime, because the way that regime is set up and the justifications for it, it cannot survive without an Armenian enemy in Artsakh or in Armenia. Now we're going to move on to the second topic of the week, which is in regards to the Turkish elections that are coming up in a couple of weeks, probably one of the most important elections probably in the history of the country, probably the most important one. They actually start with an Armenian corollary. This week, the Turkish regime actually closed their airspace to Armenian airlines, and there's one in particular, Fly One, which is an Armenia-based airline that has a lot of flights to go through Turkish territory. And this was done in response to the unveiling of a statue honoring the heroes of Operation Nemesis. For those who don't know, after the genocide, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation set up this program called Operation Nemesis, in which they went ahead and neutralized the mass murderers and the people who committed the genocide. And for that, there was actually a statue that was built to honor them in Yerevan that was opened up about 10 days ago. In response to this, the Turkish Foreign Minister, Çavuşoğlu, said essentially we're closing the airspace because of the statue, and if the statue isn't taken down, we will continue to take further actions, in quotes. It tells you a lot when a regime in this case is actually willing to block an international airspace for the purposes of honoring mass murderers. That's pretty much all you need to know about that country and that regime. And as far as their airspace is concerned, this is too polite of a show for me to say what I would really do with that, but just use your imagination. One of the most telling aspects in the Turkish elections is to the extent that both the Russian government and the regime in Baku have thrown their entire support behind the Erdoğan government and the Erdoğan regime. This includes all kinds of Azeri political figures. This actually led to Aliyev actually going to campaign with Erdoğan himself in Izmir, essentially throwing his weight behind him. Now let's move on to the Russian support, a very visible Russian support for the Erdoğan campaign. There's actually been reports in the Middle East Eye in which there's thousands of Russian-controlled bots on social media, on Twitter, have all switched from Russian to Turkish to essentially help Erdoğan during his campaign. A couple of months ago, there was actually $15 billion that was actually deposited by the Russians into this Turkish central bank because they obviously have tremendous economic problems and a currency that's going to collapse after the election, no matter who wins the election, to sort of prop things up until this election to help Erdoğan. And during this week's, there was a launch. They actually moved forward the launch of this nuclear power plant that's not even finished, that the Russians are building in Turkey. Putin was pretty much endorsing Erdoğan in the warmest possible words, the types of language that he usually uses when expressing his love for his dogs. Frankly, none of this should be a surprise. The Ankara-Baku-Moscow axis and alliance is quite real, and they all support each other when it comes to issues of regime survival. There's strong commercial relationships right now because when the Azeris are laundering oil and gas for the Russians, it's actually all of it goes through Turkey, especially SOCAR, the Azeri oil company, actually launders and processes illegally brought in Russian oil to bust Western sanctions. So they're all in business together and making money off each other. And there's also a very personal, deep personal relationship, specifically between the Azeri regime and the Turkish leadership. And they're essentially in family business when it comes to stealing and robbing from their people. Now, what does all of this mean for us in the big scheme of things? And that's what concerns me. And in the short run, any kind of an opposition victory is actually preferable to Erdoğan winning re-election, even though the reality of it is that Erdoğan is not going to leave. The most likely scenario that if he loses an election, he's not going to leave. And I'm saying this not because the opposition, frankly, is going to be any more favorable to us. However, any post-Erdoğan regime that starts going after Erdoğan and his family is going to unravel and bring out a lot to light about their relationships with Baku, how the two regimes help each other and the criminal activities that they're involved with. Any kind of a contradiction between Baku and the Turkish regime is in our interest. Now we're going to move on to the last topic of the week, which is some comments about the 108th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. And I want to put it in a contemporary context, not in a historical one, of what happened 108 years ago. And specifically talk about what have we learned in the past 108 years. And I think there's two things. The first one is that given the fact that there's 120,000 Armenians that are in danger of becoming the victims of the second Armenian Genocide, it's fair to say that we haven't learned much. And the second one is that this is the greatest proof of our failure as a nation, as a state, and frankly, as a diaspora. What are the two primary lessons that we need to learn from this? The first one is that we should never, ever be in a position where the life and security of Armenians anywhere is outsourced to anyone but to us. I'll give an example. It's pathetic that the safety and security of 120,000 Armenians in Artsakh are in the hands of a Russian state that is busy blackmailing us for the purposes of our enemies. It's also pathetic that a regime like Ilham's has any say over the lives of any Armenians anywhere. And lastly, it's, as useful as they are, it's pathetic that we're actually happy about having EU monitors at our borders. And this is for a country that has a very strong martial tradition, the people that have a very strong martial tradition, from Marshal Baghramyan during World War II to all kinds of Armenians that have been the highest levels of the NATO military command. This is all a disgraceful development that we need to be happy about other people coming in to do this or that for us to protect our country. What is the second lesson of all this? All that matters, frankly, is raw power employed by ruthless men and women to defend our interests. All else are lies and illusions. In conclusion, as dark as this moment is, and indeed it is very dark, the tides of history have been actually blowing against us for the past 20, 25 years, but those tides are actually changing, and where it matters and what I'm referring to is in the field of economics. At the end of the day, if you have the economic wherewithal, you can protect yourself and actually enforce your interests, and in many cases impose your will on others. Our task is a simple one. It is to get rich, it is to get strong, and all else will fall into place. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
Barzini's dead. So is Philip Tatalia, Mo Green, Stracci, Cuneo. Today I settle all family business, so don't tell me you're innocent, Carlo. Admit what you did. Get him a drink. Come on. Don't be afraid, Carlo. Come on. You think I make my sister a widow?